You remember the moment the laughter stopped, don't you? That silence wasn't peace. It was the funeral of your innocence. They laughed when you dreamed. They mocked when you tried. They called your fire madness, your vision delusion. But that laughter, that bitter, hollow laughter, it was the sound of people too afraid to evolve. They wanted you small, predictable, harmless, because people like you remind them of everything they'll never become. You showed them what ambition looks like without a leash, and they panicked. Their whispers became knives. Their fake smiles became traps. Every time you tried to rise, they pulled you back into their comfort zone, a place where potential dies quietly. And you stayed there for a while, thinking maybe you were the problem. But the truth, you were never broken. You were being built. Every betrayal was a hammer shaping the steel inside you. Every rumor was a nail sealing your old self inside a coffin you would one day dig up and burn. You learned something they never will. Silence is a weapon. You trained in it. You sharpened it. You became fluent in the language of stillness, the kind that screams louder than any applause. Let them talk. Let them pretend. Because while they were busy seeking approval, you were sculpting vengeance out of patience. You were learning how to move without noise, how to kill without chaos. But every quiet moment was a weapon sharpening itself in the dark. That's what they didn't see. They mistook your calm for surrender, your restraint for weakness. They didn't realize you were writing their eulogies in silence. You started noticing patterns, how every friend disappears when you fall, how every supporter turns spectator the second you bleed. You learned the world doesn't clap for your scars. It laughs at them until you turn them into armor. And that's exactly what you did. You forged every wound into a warning. You stopped bleeding for people who'd never even show up to your funeral. You started walking like you owed no one an explanation. They thought your silence meant defeat, but you were just waiting for the thunder to catch up. Because storms don't announce themselves. They arrive, and everything trembles. History doesn't remember the polite. It remembers the defiant, the mad ones, the quiet ones who turned their silence into a roar that shattered centuries. They forget the crowd, but they never forget the one who walked away from it. You see, betrayal doesn't end you. It edits you. It deletes the softness. It rewrites your script. And when it's done, what's left is something they can't define, can't destroy, can't replace. That's why they'll start whispering your name. Not in admiration, but in fear. Because deep down, they'll know. You saw through them. You saw through the illusion of friendship, of loyalty, of love that only lasted when you were losing. You stopped waiting for their validation. You stopped begging for their stage. You built your own, out of ruins and rage. Every time they said you changed, you smiled, because that was the point. You were never meant to be understood. You were meant to be remembered. And when the dust settles, when their names fade into forgotten pixels and hollow graves, yours will echo through silence, through storms, through the ruins of everything they once worshipped, because you never wanted to fit in their story. You were meant to end it. They called it loyalty, right until they broke it. Funny, isn't it? How loyalty sounds sacred until it's inconvenient. How promises melt the moment they're tested. How the ones who swore to stand beside you disappear the second the fire gets too close. You gave them everything: time, trust, truth, and they sold it. Cheap. For comfort, for convenience, for applause from strangers who didn't know the war you fought for them. They smiled in your face while counting the knives behind their backs. They clapped for you in public, then mocked your scars in secret. And when you fell, they called it karma. But when they fall, they'll call it unfair. That's betrayal. It never comes from your enemies. It wears your colors. It speaks your language. It knows your weaknesses because you handed them over in the name of trust. The knife they planted in your back became the key that unlocked your true nature. It cut deep, yes, but it also cut open your illusions. You saw people for what they really are. Loyal until it costs them. Honest until it's inconvenient. Supportive until your success threatens their comfort. And that realization, that brutal, unfiltered truth, changed you forever. You stopped seeking loyalty. You started demanding alignment. You stopped chasing love that needed convincing. You started building walls with fingerprints still wet with betrayal. That's evolution. Not soft, not poetic, not peaceful. Real evolution hurts. It breaks you open so the weaker version of you can suffocate inside. You learn that betrayal doesn't destroy. It refines. It strips you bare, forces you to rebuild piece by piece until every bone in your body becomes a fortress. You learned that pain has a purpose, and that purpose is power. The fire that burned you taught you how to walk through flames without flinching. You used to fear the heat. Now you command it. You became the very thing that terrified them. Unbreakable. And when you finally stood again, they didn't recognize you. They said you changed. No, you adapted. You became immune to manipulation, deaf to pity, blind to approval. You stopped apologizing for the monster they built, because that's what betrayal does. It kills the saint and awakens the beast. It erases your hesitation and replaces it with precision. You no longer react. You calculate. You no longer beg. You build. You no longer fear being alone, because solitude became your empire. Like Caesar watching his Senate turn, you realized even kings fall when surrounded by sheep. And so you learned to stand alone, because loyalty means nothing when it's surrounded by convenience. You saw it in history, too. Every empire fell not because of outside enemies, but because of rot within. Trust turned to treason. Allies turned to vultures. And still, the great ones rose again, colder, sharper, more dangerous. You carry that same blueprint now. They thought betrayal broke you. It only broke the version of you that still believed in mercy. Every scar became scripture. Every silence became strategy. Every flash of rage became rocket fuel. You learned how to weaponize pain, how to take heartbreak and turn it into focus, how to turn loss into armor. You built in darkness what they could never build in daylight. While they whispered, you worked. While they mocked, you mastered. While they slept, you sharpened. You stopped bleeding. You started building. And the best part, you didn't even need revenge. Your success became it. They'll see your name and choke on their own regret. Because nothing haunts traitors more than the rise of the one they buried. Now you move differently. You don't react. You respond. You don't explain. You execute. You don't seek closure. You create distance. And in that distance you grow stronger, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. Because betrayal taught you the truth. No one is irreplaceable, except the one who refuses to be broken. Every time someone lied to you, you became more fluent in silence. Every time they left, you learned how to carry your own crown. Every time they doubted you, you built another throne. In the ruins of their belief, the world calls it bitterness, but you know better. It's clarity. Cold, surgical, necessary clarity. The kind that separates survivors from dreamers. The kind that makes legends out of the forgotten. Let them keep talking about loyalty. You've outgrown it. Because loyalty without depth is just decoration. And you've burned too many times to trust pretty words. From now on, you measure people by their silence during your storms, not their cheers during your victories. And those who remain, they're not your circle, they're your army. The rest, they'll come back one day pretending they never left, pretending they were with you all along. Let them. Smile, because you already buried their version of you and built a monument over its grave. That's the anatomy of betrayal. It's the autopsy of the old self and the birth of the one they can't kill. Every betrayal was a lesson in disguise, and you learned too well. When they buried you, they didn't know you were a seed. They thought it was over, that the dirt they threw on your name would smother you forever. They thought you'd rot quietly, forgotten, humiliated, erased. But you didn't die. You evolved. See, that's the thing about people like you. They never understand the kind of strength it takes to rebuild when everything is gone. They see the ruin and assume it's your ending. But ruins are just the foundations of something greater. From the rubble of your failure, you built a fortress. You took the debris of disappointment and turned it into walls no one could climb. You used the stones they threw as stepping platforms. You carved your name into every scar they left. You stopped begging for light. You became it. You stopped asking for permission. You took it. They forgot your name. And that's when you became unstoppable. Because obscurity is power. Silence is camouflage. When they stopped watching, you started building. When they stopped caring, you started conquering. Let them live in comfort. You trained in chaos. They chased validation. You hunted purpose. They craved applause. You mastered solitude. They built for approval. You built for survival. Every night you cried became steel. Every scar became strategy. Every wound became a map leading straight to dominance. You learned how to walk barefoot through fire and still smile. You learned that peace isn't the absence of war. It's the control of it. You learned that pain is not punishment. It's promotion. And that silence is not weakness. It's weaponry. You became something else. Something colder. Something deliberate. A force that doesn't beg, doesn't break, doesn't bend. You learned to watch the world through different eyes, no longer seeking pity, but studying patterns. You began to move like a storm behind glass, calm on the outside, chaos on the inside. They called it arrogance. You called it evolution, because only those who've lost everything understand what it truly means to be free. Free from expectation, free from illusions, free from needing anyone's permission to exist loudly. You stopped waiting for destiny. You became it. And when the world tried to bury you again, you didn't resist. You smiled, because you knew what they didn't. Seeds don't fight the dirt. They use it. That's how rebirth works. You take what was meant to kill you and use it to fuel the rise. You take ashes and build an empire. You take failure and sculpt it into a monument. Every time they said, "You're done," you grew sharper. Every time they mocked your silence, you grew wiser. Every time they celebrated your fall, you learned how to control gravity. You rose, not as who you were, but as something else entirely. Something forged in the crucible of isolation. Something born out of unspoken rage. You became your own creator, sculptor, executioner, and savior. The world calls it obsession. You call it rebirth, because obsession is what happens when purpose replaces pain. And no one can cage a soul that no longer fears breaking. Like the phoenix, you didn't just rise. You burned the sky on your way up. You didn't want wings. You wanted fire. You didn't return to seek validation. You returned to redefine vengeance. Now they look at you differently, not with pity, not with mockery, with fear, because they realize you're not chasing their crowns. You're melting them. You're rewriting what power looks like, what survival sounds like, what resurrection feels like. They see you standing where you once fell and call it luck, but you know better. It wasn't luck. It was labor. It was nights with no light, years with no recognition, victories with no witnesses. It was failure turned weapon, and pain turned prophecy. Every empire, every legend, every unstoppable name in history, they all started the same way, buried, forgotten, laughed at, until one day the ground cracked open and they walked out, fire-eyed, unbothered, immortal. And that's you now. You've outgrown sympathy. You've outlived pity. You've become the warning every traitor whispers to themselves before they sleep. You don't need to roar anymore. The silence does it for you. You don't need to chase revenge. Your existence is revenge. You don't need to scream for validation. Your success is louder than their legacy. You've rebuilt yourself into something they can't approach without trembling. Something the world can't label without lying. Something they'll spend the rest of their lives trying to understand and failing to imitate. You didn't return to prove them wrong. You returned to remind them what power feels like. Now they whisper when they say your name. The same mouths that spat venom now trembled in your presence. The same hands that pushed you down now freeze when you pass by. The same eyes that rolled when you spoke now look away in silence. Because fear, real fear, doesn't come from threats. It comes from realization. The realization that you survived everything they prayed would destroy you. They built a world on your silence, and now that silence haunts them. They used to laugh. Now they flinch, because your name no longer belongs to memory. It belongs to consequence. Power isn't spoken, it's felt. In the way the air shifts when you enter a room. In the way hearts skip when your shadow passes. In the way silence wraps itself around your name like armor. You became the nightmare they prayed would never wake. The ghost of their guilt. The storm that carries their regrets. The consequence they thought they'd never face. They used to say, "You've changed," and they're right. You changed the rules. You changed the narrative. You changed the balance of fear, because you realized something they never could. Mercy feeds parasites. Silence feeds legends. And revenge, true revenge, isn't blood. It's presence. They hate what they can't control. They fear what they can't kill. And now, you are both. Every scar they gave you became a crown jewel in your arsenal. Every insult they threw became a line in your prophecy. Every doubt they planted became the foundation of your empire. They tried to erase you, but in doing so, they wrote your legend. You turned mockery into myth, revenge into art, and pain into precision. Now look at them, shrinking in the very spotlight they once stole from you. Their confidence collapses under your silence. Their arrogance melts under your gaze, because deep down, they know. The tables didn't turn by luck. They turned by design. You studied their patterns. You memorized their moves. You learned their language, their motives, their weaknesses, and then you used it all. Not for revenge, but for mastery. That's power. Power isn't shouting. It's watching kings tremble when you whisper. It's watching your enemies congratulate you while choking on envy. It's the calm smile that replaces the rage. It's the control that comes after chaos. Now you walk through the world differently. Every step is calculated. Every silence is strategic. Every glance is a reminder. You're not here to prove anymore. You're here to dominate. You've become what they feared most. A memory that won't fade. A lesson they'll never forget. And the irony, they made you. They forged you through betrayal, through mockery, through fire. And now they must live in the shadow of their own creation. Every empire that laughed at the lone wolf now counts its days in whispers. Every pretender who thought they'd buried you now checks the ground for tremors. Because you didn't just rise, you changed the weather. You became the storm they can't outlast, and you're not done. Because fear, once earned, must be maintained. And you maintain it not through chaos, but through control. You don't chase anymore. You attract. You don't explain. You observe. You don't attack. You exist, and existence alone terrifies them. You've entered the era where respect isn't requested. It's instinctual. Your presence demands it. Your silence enforces it. Your legacy guarantees it. They tell stories about you now. Exaggerated, twisted, fearful stories. But they don't realize something. The more they talk, the louder your legend grows. The more they whisper, the deeper your name roots into eternity. Because that's how legends are born. Not in applause, but in fear. Not in celebration, but in whispers that refuse to die. And when they finally kneel, when they finally understand what you've become, It won't be out of respect. It'll be out of recognition. The recognition that they were never your competition. They were your creation. They used to call you broken. Then they called you dangerous. Now, they call you inevitable. There's a strange peace in power, the kind that grows from ashes. Peace built on fire is louder than any applause. It is calm that comes after the world learns what it did wrong. It is quiet that tastes like victory. You no longer chase their cheers. You stopped begging for smiles. What you crave now is simpler, darker, deeper. You crave their silence. Silence is the currency of fear. Silence buys you space. Silence makes rulers nervous. When they can't speak your name without a shiver, you have arrived. The world bends around your name. Not in worship, but in warning. Not in adoration, but in caution. Your name is a pronouncement, a borderline. It separates those who survive from those who pale. Every scar you wear is a sentence. They tried to erase you. They failed. Those scars speak louder than legends. They read like proof. You carry proof that their hands once reached for your throat and failed. You are the storm they can't predict. Not because you are chaotic, because you are deliberate. You strike with the inevitability of weather. You arrive. You change the map. The landscape rearranges itself around your will. You're the fire they can't contain. Not because you burn everything, because you only burn what must be burned. You're selective, surgical, efficient. Like a smith tempering metal, you drop the weak and keep the strong. Let them build kingdoms of comfort. Let them stack coins and cliques and cheap crowns. You build something heavier, something older, something that keeps. You build history. History does not require applause. History requires consequence. It requires a name attached to a line of cause and effect, so sharp it cannot be forgotten. You are that line. Think of fallen kings. Julius Caesar bled, yet his name stretched into centuries. Alexander's shadows walked cities he'd never visit. Empires crumble. Names persist. They whisper about kings who died loud. They whisper a lot more about the ones who died silent, but changed everything before they fell. What you leave will not be monuments made of stone. It will be the tremor in a betrayer's sleep. It will be the pause in a court that once laughed. It will be the way young ones tell the story of the quiet that ended their childhood comforts. Legacy is not a trophy. Legacy is a verdict. It is the sentence history pronounces after the trial of time. And you are building a verdict that will outlast calendars. You do not need to shout your triumph. You stand, and the ground takes notice. You stand, and heirs argue quietly about your methods. You stand, and those who claimed you are nothing rearrange their eulogies. There's a calm wrath in your posture now, not blind fury, cold justice, measured, calculated, precise. You do not rage, you resolve. You do not unleash, you exact. People will tell stories about how you rose. They will add color, spice, exaggeration. Let them. Myths feed themselves on rumor, but truth lives in small details. A silence at a table, a door that no one opens, the sudden stillness when your name is near. Those details are harder to erase. Those are the things that pass between generations in low voices. You once sought to be noticed. Now you make the world notice by forcing it to remember. You shape memory like a sculptor. You carve out spaces where your shadow will fall long after the sun forgets your childhood. Do not be sentimental about this. Power is not pretty. It is weight. It is a ledger that tallies the cost of every injury, every slight, every night of hunger. You paid the bill. Others will inherit the tab. And when their bones are dust, when their names are footnotes, when their empires are a lesson in hubris, yours will still hum in the air. People will check their pride when your name is on their tongues. They will straighten their posture, lower their voices, and remember the seasons they valued comfort over courage. That is immortality of a certain kind, not the romantic kind, not the kind for poets, the kind that lives in practical terror, the kind that keeps enemies awake, the kind that keeps descendants honest. You wanted to be feared. You wanted to be known. You wanted to be the answer to the question they never asked aloud. What happens to those who break the rules? Now you are the answer. Let them call you tyrant. Let them call you villain. Words are splinters. They pierce, but then are removed. What sticks, what stays, is your effect. What stays is the silence, the recalibration, the cautious bow. This is your throne, built from ash, hardened by loss, polished by consequence. It does not glitter. It does not need followers to validate it. It simply is, solid, unmovable, final. And when the trumpet of their histories sputters, and their names fall like brittle leaves, when strangers scroll past their memory without a blink, your shadow will remain. A long, slow reminder that someone once refused to be small. A reminder that someone stood among the ruins and decided to rewrite the rules. Because your name will be whispered long after they're gone. You were never chasing fame. You were chasing forever. Fame dies when the applause fades. Forever begins when silence remembers you. You didn't want to be liked. You wanted to be known, not for a moment, but for eternity. You wanted your existence to haunt history, to echo long after the bones of your enemies turned to dust. The world fears memory more than monsters, and you became both. They feared you not because of what you did, but because of what you proved. You proved that pain could evolve into precision, that betrayal could become blueprint, that silence could become scripture. You turned your suffering into a monument that no storm could wash away. Even time hesitates before saying your name, because time knows it couldn't break you. It threw its winters, its losses, its loneliness at you, and you didn't flinch. You didn't kneel, you absorbed. You let it carve you into something eternal. Every generation has its ghosts. You became the one they whisper about when the lights go out. You became the reminder that some fires refuse to die, even when buried beneath centuries of ash. Legends don't need witnesses, they need echoes. And your echo moves through ages like a haunting. Cold, quiet, inescapable. The young will feel it without knowing why. The broken will hear it in their hearts. The proud will pretend not to recognize it. But they will, because your story isn't inspiration. It's warning. You showed them that greatness doesn't smile. It scars. That legacy isn't about being remembered. It's about being impossible to forget. Every time they build, they'll think of how you burned. Every time they speak of power, they'll mention your silence. Because you didn't just change the world. You changed the definition of what it fears. The fools who mocked you will fade. Their dust scattered by your storm. Their laughter will rot in their own echoes, while yours will linger in the bones of history. You don't need monuments. You don't need marble. You are carved in something heavier. Consequence. You exist now in the language of those who dare, in the fire that lives in those who were broken but refuse to stay down, in the eyes of the few who understand that glory isn't handed, it's taken. That's immortality, not a statue, not a crown, but an infection spreading through generations, through minds, through blood. A silent revolution wrapped in your name. They'll teach your story as a warning to the weak, and a roadmap for the relentless. They'll tell children not to be like you, and those same children will grow up dreaming to be. Because rebellion ages well when truth is on its side. And you were the truth no one was brave enough to speak. What remains now isn't your face, it's your fire. That unstoppable, untamable flame that refuses to fade. You are not remembered for your smile. You are remembered for your impact. The kind that leaves marks. The kind that bends timelines. The kind that makes even silence seem loud. And when death came, you didn't beg, didn't cry, didn't kneel. You looked it in the eyes and said, "You're late," because you already lived 1,000 lives in one. You already left enough echoes to outlive centuries. The truth is, death doesn't erase greatness. It amplifies it. It crystallizes your defiance into myth. It turns your story into a sermon for the broken, a manual for survival, a gospel for the misunderstood. You've become what time can't contain. You've become what silence can't bury. You've become legend, not by choice, but by inevitability. And that's the difference between the remembered and the forgotten. They chased followers. You built followers of fire. They sought comfort. You created chaos. And in that chaos, found order. They chased fame. You became forever. Because there's something untouchable about what you built. It wasn't for them. It wasn't for praise. It was for the few who would come after. The ones who'd find themselves standing in the same darkness you once knew, whispering your words beneath their breath. They'll never meet you, but they'll feel you. In the hunger, in the silence, in the refusal to break. And long after the world forgets its kings, its saints, its fragile gods, your shadow will remain, unbent, unbroken, unforgiven. Because the world doesn't reward purity, it remembers power, and your power didn't die. It evolved. It grew teeth. It grew roots. It grew wings. You're no longer a name. You're a force. You're the stillness before the storm, and the thunder after it. You are the ghost of consequence. You are proof that some souls were never meant to fade. They were meant to echo. And when the last candle of their legacy burns out, when the last statue crumbles, when the last echo of their laughter dissolves into dust, your name will still command the silence.